This video covers setting up shading for analysis in Sefaira's web application. It applies to both Sefaira architecture and Sefaira systems. Let's go to the Shading tab. And there are a couple approaches to shading in Sefaira. One is you can model it in your 3D modeling application in SketchUp or in Revit and make sure it's tagged as shading. And by default, anything you've modeled will be included in the analysis. However, you can disable it by unticking this checkbox, Analyze Shading Drawn in the 3D Model. The reason you might want to do that is because the other option in Sefaira is to explore shading parametrically, and that's the box you see below. And that can be really useful in early design in order to do a couple things. One is determine how important shading is for your design in terms of either annual energy use or peak cooling loads or system sizing, whatever it is that you're looking at. And number two, what is the optimal shading length and shading configuration for your building? Once you know that, it often makes sense to then go back into your model and model a specific design. So I usually start out with the parametric shading, determine importance, determine the optimal configuration, then model it, bring the model back in, and compare the model to the earlier parametric studies. So that said, there are a number of types of parametric shading available in Sefaira. You can look at horizontal overhangs, small and large configurations. You can look at vertical fins on the edges of the windows. You can look at external operable blinds and internal operable blinds, as well as external Venetian blinds. Now, as we look at shading, usually you have different shading strategies for different orientations of the building. So to be able to control that, you can click this toggle, and this will allow you to set up shading independently for each of the building's orientations. So let's dive in a little deeper. Let's say we wanted to study horizontal shading on the south facade of this building. So I'm going to open up the horizontal shading tab, and the value that you see here is a ratio of shade length to window height, not the length of the actual shade itself. And to see what I mean, let's open up this tooltip, and you can see that the shade is actually proportional to the total height of the window. The benefit of this approach is that different sizes of windows on your facade can still have relatively the same amount of shading. Now, this is a great application for a feature in Sefaira called response curves, which is the type of parametric analysis. If you click, you can see that this a little icon appears next to the input variables, and if you click that, it brings open a response curve window. And you can look at a range of values, so you can configure no shading out to a proportion of 2:1, so the shade depth is twice the height of the window. And you'll be able to see if there's an optimum point or point of diminishing returns for this variable. So we can see, rather than testing out just by trial and error, we can take a look at if there's an optimum shading length for the south facade. And you can look at that optimum according to a number of values. Again, if you're looking at trying to reduce the cooling size or the peak cooling loads, I'm just going to take a look quickly at the EOI value. In this case, the EOI is actually going up as we add shading. We must be blocking out beneficial heat gain in the winter months. And so this is a case where we might not want to add too much shading from an energy perspective. Okay, let's take a look at some of the other shading types. Now you can notice there that you're able to add both horizontal and vertical shading at the same time if you like. Vertical shading is a similar input. The length here is not a length per se, but a ratio of the width of the window to the depth of the shade. And then the final option, if we close these up, is automated blinds and shades, where you can select from the type of shading, external blinds or Venetian, internal blinds or Venetian. You can select a control basis for the operability of that shading. Is it operable based on the amount of solar gain that you're getting on the glass, based upon the outdoor air temperature, or based upon the zone air temperature, the temperature of the zone in which that window sits? And then for each of those, you'll be able to control the threshold. So if I change this input, you can see the input below changes to allow me to control the threshold at which that shade is deployed or retracted. And again, this may be a good way to use response curves to figure out if there's an optimum threshold there for controlling those shading elements. So that's shading, a very powerful tool that allows you to figure out what shading elements may be best for your building very early in design, and then model them and bring it back in.